Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
Our topic tonight is writing about music. You may have heard of it since this is Austin. It's a thing that we do, we're kind of known for. Both like the creating of it and the listening to it, but also the writing about it. And we have three people tonight who write about music in different kinds of ways, and we're going to talk to them about what they do. So I'm just going to launch into the introductions. To my left is Joe Gross. He's the author of Fugazi's In on the Killtaker, part of the 33 1/3 series. He's written for Spin, Rolling Stone, The Village Voice, The Washington City Paper, Radio On, and more. He covers culture, popular, and for the Austin American Statesman. Please welcome Joe Gross.
Thank you.
Kayleigh Hughes is a music critic for Consequence of Sound and a contributor at local music publication Avred. She has also written for Pitchfork, Vox, Paste, and the Austin American Statesman. Please welcome Kayleigh.
Against all logic, it's pronounced overload. We don't know why.
It's I would have never guessed that. Overload. And Omise'eke Tinsley is Associate Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies and Associate Director for the Center for Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, where she teaches Beyonce Feminism, Rihanna Womanism each spring. In November of this year, the University of Texas Press will release Beyonce in Formation, Remixing Black Feminism, a black feminist reading of Beyonce's Lemonade. Azile's Mirrors Black Queer Genders and the Work of the Imagination, another one of her books, explores spirituality and sexuality in 21st century black queer literature, dance, music, and film from the Caribbean and African North America. A registered yoga instructor, she teaches Vinyasa yoga and leads yoga workshops entitled Sister Sutras, Yoga Philosophy, and Practice for Black Women, to all black, all women playlists that always include Beyonce. Please welcome Omise'eke. So I thought I would start with just sort of a general question about how you approach the music that you're writing about and how you approach like the writing about it. Because, one would assume that if you're writing about music, it's in part because you're a fan. But, you're also writing perhaps as a scholar or as a historian or as a critic or as, a kind of like somebody just saying, listen to this or think about it in this way. And that's a lot of different sort of like perspectives and roles to play all at once. And so I wonder, and Joe, we can start with you. And like in your book on Fugazi's, this one particular album, how did you find the role that you were going to play as you wrote about this album? Because you're obviously a fan, but you're also like playing the role of like a historian and saying, here's how this thing was created.
I knew that I wanted to pitch a book about the band, and theirs was a catalog that I knew really well. And so I decided that I didn't want to do it if they didn't want to participate. I didn't feel like writing I didn't want to write just like me yakking about how great the record was for 200 pages, because that was not interesting to me and probably not interesting to a reader, because there are so few books about them. And so I contacted the band and said, I want to pitch this. I don't want to do it if you don't want to participate. They said, sure, yes, we will. So I pitched Killtaker because it came out at a particularly interesting time in American independent music and rock music in the 90s. And when they accepted the pitch, I decided that I wanted to talk to the band as much as humanly possible about this and just sort of exhaust them as a resource and keep my voice as minimal as possible, because I realized very early on that I wasn't writing particularly well about it, about the record as a critic. It just wasn't clicking for some reason. And they are all so smart and funny that it made sense to have their voices in the book as much as humanly possible. And that was what people were interested in. I mean, people want to hear, the people that are going to buy the book anyway, or that are going to read about it, are going to want to hear from them a lot more than they want to hear from me. So when I wrote that, it was definitely keep the band's voices as forward as possible.
Mm-hmm. Kaylee, you wrote an essay on Liz Phair in particular, a one album, Exile in Guyville, and you sort of took a different approach, because that essay that you wrote, it's about the album, but it's also about your encountering it for the first time, and you're listening to it again, about the person who introduced it to you, about that relationship, and then sort of like the world that Liz Phair was writing about in that particular album. I mean, that essay is as much about you and kind of like social criticism as it is about Liz Phair in that particular album. How did you locate yourself in that, and how did you figure out like the approach that you wanted to take?
Well, I mean, like you were saying, the fortunate thing is you don't have to be all of the things all at once, all the time, which is really nice, because that would be super intimidating, and music writing is intimidating enough as it is. But with Exile in Guyville, the publication knew they wanted to do some sort of revisitation of it because of its anniversary. I like writing as a consumer of music and as somebody who sort of writes about their life as if their life has a soundtrack. And so it's really very comfortable for me to write about personal events and experiences, and typically they involve music in some way. And so it's just as much a personal essay as it is an essay of music criticism. I've been struggling a lot with what the definition of criticism is recently. When I first got the gig at Consequence, none of their music reviews, their album reviews, were in the first person, and I write really regularly and really confidently in first person. So I took it as an opportunity to freak myself out and say I have to learn how to write in this detached third person voice from now on to do what they need me to do. And at a certain point, my editor was like, we were really happy, but we hired you to do what you do, which is talk from your own perspective. And so I kind of think it just depends on what you feel comfortable with and what comes naturally to you. I definitely like to push and experiment. I've been trying for a while to get myself to write a review where I don't use a single adjective, which would be fully impossible, but I keep saying I'm going to do it and then I don't. But I like the idea of trying to challenge yourself, but also knowing where your talents are and where your comforts and your strengths are. Do you have thoughts?
Well, actually, Omise'eke, this leads in really nicely to a quote from early on in the book. You say, on the first day of lecture, so this book comes out of a lecture that you've taught at UT, and he said, lines of black women and queers approached me to express excitement that they were in a class that took Beyonce's music seriously, that someone was reflecting back that the lyrics they sing, the songs they dance to, their shirts that proclaim, I woke up like this, just might be important and worthwhile, just might be the meaningful sources of empowerment they always felt them to be. Greeting this line of feminist Beyonce fans, I saw clearly, I'm just one of thousands of black women and queers in Texas looking to Beyonce as a gilded mirror, an artistic creation with a capacity to bounce light off our visions for next millennium feminism. And so in terms of how you approach the work, but also who you're writing for, you get the sense early on that this is for, not just fans of Beyonce, but also people who are seeing something in her music and in her videos and in her images that wants to be taken seriously in a particular kind of way.
For sure, and I think one of the things that was gratifying about writing this is I am a Beyonce fan. I'm a member of the Beehive. I'm all of that, right? I don't have On the Run tour tickets, but other than that, I meet all the criteria. And so there are a lot of people in my life who are curious about why it is that I'm so interested in Beyonce and are not themselves interested in Beyonce. And one of the things that I find about with black women is often we have very strong opinions. We love Beyonce, we hate Beyonce, there's not a lot of middle ground. And so a lot of people in my life are like, no, not Beyonce, but they were interested in reading the book because what my interest in beyond Beyonce is what does it mean to be a Black woman living, particularly in the U.S. South at this moment, and how do we create visions of possibility for ourselves? And so Beyonce becomes kind of a mirror, but also a jumping off point to think through how do we make sense of our lives? How do we make sense of what it means to be a mother in a time when children's lives are precarious? How do we celebrate ourselves? How do we find pleasure? How do we recognize our own beauty? And so I think that the book, that Beyonce is in the title, but for me the book is a love letter to Black women.
And you've also got a great line in there. You quote a critic, Sidney Fontaine Lewis, who says that she supplements critical theory with personal narrative in order to write herself, quote, into history by writing herself a history. The idea that that by writing yourself a narrative, you're creating this narrative for yourself. It's a narrative that applies to lots of people, not just yourself.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
How did you sort of locate yourself in this story? Because, I mean, one could say like it's a book about Beyonce. Like,
right.
Why are you in it? But like that's also like you're a fan. You're listening to the music. You're like how did you find how to put yourself into the story?
Well, one day, Casey Cottrell at University of Texas Press sent me an email saying, I hear you teach this Beyonce class, and she just did this. This was just after Lemonade came out. Would you like to write a book about Beyonce? I'm like, what am I, stupid? Like, of course I want to write a book about Beyonce. And so we had a conversation, and he was like, well, I would like it to draw on the course, and I think to make it relatable to people, there could be an autobiographical element, like what it was like to teach the course. And I was like, oh, okay, that's a good idea. I've never written autobiography before, period. And so this, for me, it kind of always happens when I'm writing. What I set out to write and what ended up happening were two different things. And so what Beyonce made, or what going through and thinking about the music history that goes into Lemonade and the social history that it reflects right now, it made me think about stories from my family, right? And so I ended up weaving in different kinds of family history. And at a certain point, Casey was like, this was not what I expected. And either you have to take out the autobiographical, or you have to develop a through line for it. And I surprised us both by saying, I think I want to develop a through line for it, because I felt like that was what was going to make it interesting to people. Because maybe I'm not as much of a Beyonce fan as I should be for saying this, but in 50 years, Lemonade, it's not going to have that. But in 50 years, people may not be interested in Lemonade in 50 years. But I think in 50 years, people will still be interested in what has it meant to live as a Black woman in the U.S. South. And so those were the stories. And the personal stories certainly aren't just mine, right? They're stories that other people have gifted me. I wanted to make sure that those got in there.
Kaylee, just thinking about the audience that you're writing for, you've written for a number of different outlets, and I would assume that like the readership is different for each one. Does that determine how you write and who you're writing for?
I mean, a little bit. These days, the audience is not that different. Depending on the website, the people reading Paste are also probably reading Consequence, are also probably reading Pitchfork. But certainly there are very specific types of music writing, even at those publications, and what's expected of you. Like a album critique, like an album review, is going to look a whole lot different than a feature, which is going to look a whole lot different than just sort of an op-ed. I don't know. I should probably think about my audience more. I'm just too self-involved for that. I think that, for the Statesman, certainly it's a different audience. It's much more like broad. It's for like every age and every demographic. And so when I do concert reviews for the Statesman, it's very much like, paint me a picture of what happened there and what the audience experience that I was witnessing was, so people can kind of get a sense of like their city and their environment and what's happening in their city. But with national publications, you can kind of reach anybody, so you can be super niche. Like I can write to people that are almost exactly me, and there will be an audience for that, which is pretty cool.
So like with like that Liz Phair essay, did you feel the need to tell people like, let's back up, here's what this album was, here's who Liz Phair, I say was, but she's still around obviously. Or did you just assume that everybody who was going to read that probably knew the album already?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's something that you always have to think about when you start writing. I really hate doing the expository bit where you describe that, like, you know, this person is a punk musician and they're from this place, when I want to get into talking about my ideas. But that is something that, you're right, very much is determined by who your audience is, and you have to do that in an album review. You have to tell people who might not know everything about this artist, you know, just lay the groundwork for them. In something like the Liz Phair piece, that album had been written about to death in the months leading up to it, because not only was it the 25th anniversary, but there was a re-release that happened 2 months before that. So every music critic in the entire world had their Liz Phair piece out. And many of them got to speak to her, which I did not get to do. She said no, and I respect her so much for that, because it was outside the window of 1 month that she was doing interviews. And I thought that was a very good expression of boundaries for Liz Phair on behalf of her publicist. So yeah, I had to, I didn't feel the need to be like, hey, by the way, here's who Liz Phair is. Like, sometimes you have to make your audience work, and sometimes you don't want to make your audience work. It really depends on the situation.
Joe, what about you? So I will say, I know who Fugazi is. I'm familiar with like some of their work, but I would not call myself a fan or even like really knowledgeable about their work. Like when I first started reading this, like you begin with like this particular concert in DC at a particular time. And it's about the music, but it's also about like sort of the music industry and what was going on at the time. Did you think to yourself, this is a book for people who love Fugazi, love this album, or is this a book for people who are more than that?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because Bloomsbury said it had to be both. And I remember just a brief discussion, brief email exchange with my editor on the book saying, you've got to figure out a way to make it appeal to a general interest reader who just likes reading about music. I don't mean just, who likes reading about music, and you have to make it appeal to somebody who is an enormous Fugazi nerd.
What sort of details would you give for like the diehard Fugazi fans? What sort of details would you give for people who weren't as familiar with their work? I mean,
the fact that I was able to get the band hasn't been around since 2003, and they're all still friends. It wasn't like a Fleetwood Mac thing where everybody got divorced and they can't stand looking at each other. They decided to put the band on hold for a bunch of reasons that I don't really get into in the book, because it was sort of outside the scope of inquiry. But the fact that I was able to sit in a room with all four of them and their engineer on this record, and ended up talking to the producer on the phone, was just getting their voices from those series of interviews, I think was enough for the serious Fugazi nerd. For people who didn't necessarily know or care about the band, but liked listening to the radio in the 90s, be it college or top 40, there's a chapter in there about what else was going on the pop charts, what else was going on college radio, which had sort of started to embrace them, what was going on in Washington, and sort of shrinking and expanding what their context was as much as possible for the person who wasn't already necessarily a big fan of the band.
Omise'eke, did you find that you had to do some of that as well, of like the concentric circles of talking to different audiences, or thinking about what kinds of information you wanted to like parcel out in terms of, because like, there's a lot to talk about with Beyonce.
There is a lot to talk about with Beyonce. I think that my process, I actually identify with what you're saying, Kayleigh, which is I don't think about the audience that much. Not because I don't care, but because I'm trying to tell the story in a way that makes sense to me. I think I was more focused on how do I make sense of this story than will diehard Beyonce fan, right, not agree that Partition is the sexiest video on the self-titled album, you know, or I think there was also some question in the book about, well, in thinking through the title, I wanted both Black and Femme to be in the title. And originally neither was, and Black is now in the title, but Femme is not. And I think that there was a balancing act that I was asked to do about like how much specificity is going to limit readership. And my thing is, but why should it limit readership, right? Like, I don't understand that. I think that if people are interested in the story, people are interested in the story. And for me, the queerness of it is important. For me, the Black feminism of it is important. And so it's more important to me that that is foregrounded than that. Let me put it another way. I would have been more upset if somebody chose not to buy the book because they didn't see Black in the title and they're like, what is she doing, right? Like, what is she doing? Than if somebody puts it down because it has Black in the title. That I'm okay with. But I hope that, you know, there are a lot of people out there who are interested in the welfare of Black women and Black queer people and Beyonce, and, you know, will be interested in all those things together.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
The way that you describe how your writing process goes sounds like it requires a lot of trust in your own voice.
Yeah, you know, people often say things to me like, wow, you're so comfortable making yourself vulnerable. And I don't think of it that way, right? Like, or you're so comfortable doing things a different way. And my husband is still here in the back of the room, and we went to graduate school together, and we had, sorry, everybody's looking at him. He didn't dress up or anything. We had a common professor who once wrote, you know, what I write is done to save my own life, and I mean that literally, right? And I have to tell a story in the way that it makes sense to me, because if I don't, nobody else will. And so for me, like, I write the way that I write because it's saving my own life, right? Because it's mirroring back that the way that I know is a way to know, and the way that I am in the world is a way to be in the world. And I think that I couldn't do it differently. I would have nothing to say, right?
Yeah.
Some people are good at writing in voices that are strategic, and I'm just not. I always tell people I'm a double Pisces with the Leo moon. I have no sense at all.
I want to read a quote from Joe's book about Fugazi, because I think it offers a way to sort of talk about sort of the topic of writing about music. Joe, you say it's hard to find a true start to the story of In on the Killtaker. To talk about the record is to talk about the band at that point in time, and yet also all the times before. The primary function of Fugazi was to practice at least 3 days a week for 5 hours at a time, sometimes 5 days a week, and then we would tour, Canty, one of the band members, once said in an interview. Records weren't exactly an afterthought, but they weren't fussed over either, as various members of the band said over and over, so often that it's hard to pinpoint who said it first. The albums are the menu, the shows are the meal. You could say that about a lot of bands and artists. I mean, it's certainly true of Beyonce, right? So I mean, there's the albums, and then like with Lemonade, there was the whole video, the extended video. There's also like now the Vogue cover, and then of course like what she did, like the sort of what she did to make that cover her own with the photographer. With Liz Phair, there is like the album, and there's everything sort of around the album. You wrote about Amy Winehouse, and what you wrote about was not her music at all, but it was about like eating disorders and drugs and like the images that sort of musicians have to sort of, especially women musicians, are expected to have by the industry.
Yeah, it's like the cultural consumption of Amy Winehouse.
And And so there's so much that one can talk about, and it's hard to like pinpoint this is a particular thing in a particular time, because it's always changing, because they're artists and they get bored, or they just they're pushed around by the culture, or they're pushing culture. How did you manage to, Joe, I'll start with you. How did you manage to like say this is the point that I'm going to talk about? Because even with this album was, I mean, as you say, because of the way that they sort of like rehearsed and practiced and found their stuff, like it was always in flux.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. So I kind of cheated a little bit, and just sort of did a chapter that was, here we are, just a quick sort of history of the band. Here's where they came from, here's what they were doing up to this point, and then wrote a chapter on the record that they made before this one, because it was a record that they weren't particularly happy with, and why they were unhappy with it. And then went into a piece about the first chapter about the first attempt to make the record, and that ended up also being sort of similarly, I mean, not similarly. It was also a mess, but a different kind of mess. And then by the time, because making the actual record was fairly straightforward, there isn't a lot about the process of making it, because they sort of hopped into the studio and cranked it out over a number of weeks. I mean, I think the difference between something like Kill Taker and what Beyonce is doing something much more complicated and much more layered, and I don't even what the best word, multivalent, I guess is the best way to describe it, because when Lemonade came out, you have, and please correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, it just sort of appeared one day without, I'm just trying to remember this off the top of my head. It just sort of appeared. It was an album, a film, essentially, and just sort of this multimedia experience. And I think she is an artist who spends a lot more time on their records than they did. That just wasn't, it's just a different way of thinking about recording and what you want. And I think, they were operating in a context that was completely different from somebody like Beyonce. Similar to Liz Phair, but completely different from what Beyonce is operating in. And just the way people think about how you present a piece of music, like literally how you present a piece of music in 2016, is completely different from the way you would present a piece of music in 1993. Like it's just, it's the difference between orbiting the Earth and the moonshot. It's just wildly, one is comparatively very straightforward. We put out a record, we're gonna tour on it, and then, we'll practice a whole bunch and then write a bunch more songs. And that doesn't fly anymore. Beyonce is an artist who obviously responded to the times brilliantly. And I think the record is the menu and the show is the meal. They were talking about something very specific when they said that, and it was sort of a CYA comment to make, in that they did not spend a lot of time on records. It was, here we're going to do a kind of straight read on these songs, and then when you come to the show, we're going to do lots of interesting things to the songs. I always thought they operated more like a jazz band than a rock band, and not in a noodly way, but in a, here are 4 guys that are going to be communicating with each other at every moment on stage, whether you can tell they are or not. And they're going to do things to songs that, are going to blow your mind, or they're going to do something very straightforward. but I think that's what they were talking about when they made that comment. I think what Beyonce is doing is something, next level complex.
Kaylee, Joe was talking. He started off by talking about how making an album in '93 is a lot different than making an album in 2016. And I wonder, both in terms of writing about Liz Phair, that was a reissue of that album, it was an anniversary, so you're writing about the album, both like when it came out and like listening to it now. With Amy Winehouse, you were talking about the consumption of her, and so that's very much about like the business of Amy Winehouse, how she was sort of presented to us, and how we often like consume her and other female artists. Can you separate? How are you able to separate the consumption of an artist by the public from the art that they make? Are they inseparable? Can you sort of like have one and a little bit of the other?
I mean, that's a really big question, Michael.
It is.
Well, I think that the things that you and Joe have talked about like spur so many fun ideas how music writing can happen. I love that writing about a live experience and writing about a CD and writing about CD. What am I, 40?
Wow.
And
Oh boy.
writing about an audiovisual experience and everything, like writing about an artist's personality, that's all music writing, and it's all completely different, and it's all ways of experiencing music. So that's something that's really exciting in general to me about music writing, is that it's so broad. In terms of writing about listeners and cultural consumption in comparison to the artists themselves, I do think that it's like a conversation, that the world has with an artist, and that conversation has evolved. The ways in which we have that conversation have evolved since, Fugazi was making small tapes in, DC basement, to Beyonce being viewable to literally anyone on the entire earth and intending to be viewed, by anyone on the whole earth. That changes the conversations that we're having and that we're able to have. So that's how I like to think about it, and I do think that they're fairly, like, you can of course write about just one or just the other. Like, you can just write about an artist from the historical standpoint of like, here's what happened to them. And you can of course just sit and like write about an album without knowing any cultural context, like how you would, look at a painting and just talk about what you interpret about it. But you can also situate it in a cultural space and talk about how people talk about it, which is what I did with Meg White a while back, because the the conversation about her is so complex and nuanced and sexist. So like anyone talking about Meg White's music inherently has to talk about, and always does, the way that people have talked about Meg White. And so it's this like big iterative like layering of meanings as time goes on. And in 2018 we've got so many more ways to do that than we did 20, 30, 200 years ago.
Omise'eke, there, talking about like, how do you sort of like focus on a particular, like, how do you narrow your focus? Like, even with like, so you focus on Lemonade, but when that, and I'm sort of stunned to realize it was 2 years ago because it doesn't feel that long ago. When that came out, I mean, I would just go down like Twitter holes of like people talking about like, well, here's what she's referencing here, and then of course like there were so many different artists sort of like working on that album with her, and not just musicians, and then sort of like then people talking about like, well, here's what they brought to it, and here's like, and then of course like wondering about the personal background, history, and context of the album, and how do you manage to pick what you're going to talk about and what you're going to sort of like leave out, and what interpretations you're going to sort of touch on and which you're going to not?
I don't know. I think some of it is just I pick what stands out to me, and then I try and think about what it is that's behind that, right? So the first chapter of the book is about don't hurt yourself, speaking of Meg White, Jack White. And so, there was so much speculation when Lemonade came out. This is all about her marriage. Oh, now we know everything about Beyonce's marriage. And I was like, are you guys crazy? Like, Beyonce's not gonna, like, Beyonce's not our girlfriend, right? Like, it's a marketing move, it's an artistic move. And there was a moment in that song and this is where I think the invention of the visual album, which is a genre that, Beyonce has kind of put forward and that Black women are taking the lead in, which I think is really interesting. So in that video, there's a moment where the song stops and there's a clip of a Malcolm X speech, right? The most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. And that was the moment where I was sure that what I was listening to was not just a takedown of Jay-Z, who I don't particularly care for, so I could have just listened to that, but was in the blues tradition, and in a tradition of talking about individual hurt and betrayal by a man as a metaphor for a larger betrayal of being a Black woman who was promised freedom and is still, it's on my earrings, right? Was promised freedom and is still waiting for it. And so from there, and I had to do a lot of reading about this. So I knew some about the blues. I read about the blues. I read about the White Stripes, right? Like I talked to people in my own family history who were living in the U.S. South, about people who were living in the U.S. South at the time that the blues came out. So from there, I tried to figure out, okay, well, not what does everybody on Twitter need to know for them to make sense of the song to themselves, although I read that too, right? But what is it about this song that I need to know to make sense of the elements that stand out for me? And then I went with that. In Daddy Lessons, I ended up learning a whole bunch about country music that I didn't know, right? But in order to make sense of what she was doing, I didn't have to, but I chose to delve into that. And sometimes I went down paths and they didn't take me where I wanted to go, and so then I changed directions. Now I think Formation, of course, is the song that everybody had something to say about. And for me, what was really interesting to me on that track was Big Frida, right? And so that was a moment where I really chose to decenter not only what people had said about Beyonce in that album, but Beyonce herself, and focus on another fabulous performer and what her contribution meant.
What drew you to her? Because there's so many different artists who are part of that. What drew you to Big Frida in particular? Big
Frida is awesome. Big Frida is amazing, and Big Frida is the only openly queer artist on the album.
So for people in the audience who aren't familiar with her work, describe who Big Frida is.
Big Frida is a bounce artist out of New Orleans. She has a reality TV show. I forgot its name has changed. I can't remember the new name, but she is one of the more mainstream bounce artists who's kind of broken into some mainstream music scenes. She comes to Austin every once in a while, but she's very important as a trans, feminine, Black artist who occupies space on her own terms. And there's a really great clip from her TV show when she gets the call from Beyonce, right? And she's in the kitchen cooking something, right? And it's like, oh my God, it's Beyonce, right? And so there's the way that she's this kind of bridge between Beyonce, who's of course untouchable, right? I'm never gonna talk to Beyonce, right? But Beyonce is this kind of distant icon who's off touring the south of France, right? And whereas Big Frida is an artist who is actually in New Orleans, right? And who is relatable in a different kind of way from Beyonce. And for me, at the moment that Formation came out, this was year after year, it's the deadliest year on record for trans women of color, year after year, right? And so in a year in which Black trans women are dying at record rates, to have a song that is centered around a voiceover by a Black trans feminine person was important. It was important for people who needed to know that their lives mattered and their lives were possible. And so I love Formation. I love the video of Formation. I will watch it all day long. I am still sad that Big Frida is not in that. I wanted to see her. I love hearing her, but I wanted to see her. But I think next time she'll be there.
If you have never seen Big Frida live, do yourself a favor.
Yeah.
Even if you have absolutely no idea what bounce is, what it's just go.
She'll teach you.
Yeah.
She will.
Really generously.
Yes, really
Yeah.
generously.
Well, you do bring up something about music writing, which is that we do have the opportunity to like tell people what to do in ways that are good and not creepy. But like you might go home and listen to Big Frida and learn something that you didn't know before, or find something new that you liked. The fact that you've spoken about Beyonce in relation to her might give somebody an entry point to this new artist. Like, music writing is really fun in that way. It's expansive.
One of the challenges of writing about music is, even though it often involves like language often doesn't quite do justice to the experience of viewing and participating.
Yeah, there's a guy, there's a music critic named Frank Cogan, who's not a particularly well-known person, but he was quite influential on a certain generation of pop-oriented music critics in the late 80s and early 90s, guys like Chuck Eddy and Rob Sheffield and Ann Powers to a certain extent, I think. Cogan once said something that absolutely haunted me and continues to haunt me, that, and I still don't know if I agree with it or disagree with it or it's just this looming shadow, but he said once that people write about music worse than they write about anything else. And it's a terrifying idea if you want to do this long term, but I know exactly what he means, and I think everybody here knows exactly what he means, is that you start writing about music and you start and then you write about something else and you're like, this is much easier, why don't I just do this? Yeah, you got to think hard all the time, or what you're gonna produce is, a reader is gonna be able to see through it immediately.
It is the hardest thing ever. It's so much harder than other writing. And yeah, like you said, Michael, it's sounds, and it should be like, oh, just like describe the sounds, and it should be so easy, and it's not. And there are all of these like music writing sins that you have to like keep yourself from doing, Michael Azerrad, who's like a pretty big music critic, he wrote about Fugazi. He just put out a book of how not to write about music, which is like very threatening, but I think it's in good faith. I think he's a pretty good dude about it. But it also introduces the question of like, how much can you get away with, and how weird can you get? And usually that's a good thing, like get weirder. My favorite advice about music criticism comes from Meredith Graves, who what does she run now? Bandcamp? Noisy. She runs Noisy now. And she was the lead singer of Perfect Pussy, which was like a really solid, short-lived punk band from several years ago, and like really outspoken social activist. But she wrote about music criticism on this little blog, and I can't ever find it on the internet, so I just like replay it in my mind. And she was talking about all of the ways in which it had kind of gotten stale, and people really wanted to all write in a similar type of referential way. Like, if you like the Pixies and, this song from this era of New Order, then like this band will speak to you in these, but like, you have to have 7 Wikipedia tabs open to follow what they're saying. And she was saying like, her favorite type of music writing is like, this song made me want to eat a Twinkie and smash something in my garage. Like, what it like makes you feel like and do. And like it's a very experiential way to write about music. Like here's how, like, you know, I got physical goosebumps, or like I didn't want to leave my room for a couple days. You know, like those are ways to write about music that aren't necessarily like in this ultra intellectual sphere as well. So like there are ways to get experimental and weird, and it's fun. Yeah.
It's so interesting that you bring that up about trying to not like comparing to other stuff, but like, you know, talk about the experience. Because today, like to have a music panel on today, like Aretha Franklin passed away. And so there's been lots of non-music journalists writing about music and doing it in ways that are fairly predictable. I mean, like every superlative has been dropped on her, and of course, like she deserves it because she's outstanding. But you don't learn that much from the ways that she's being written about. And yet, like one of the most popular videos right now is her performance at the Kennedy Center, where you see like Barack Obama like cries, and Carole King is like doing this, and she's doing this, and then various artists in the crowd are kind of like singing along, and watching their reaction like tells you as much about her, about herself as an artist as you know, like saying that she was, you know, the queen of soul or whatever. How do you avoid that kind of thing, especially like with Beyonce, who is, you know, another sort of superlative artist in so many ways? How do you avoid falling into either like cliches that like have been created around her, or just like cliches about the ways that we talk about particular kinds of artists?
I don't know. One thing that I will say that I'm quite open about in the book is I think Beyonce is really good looking. I think my daughter once said, "Mom, you just talk about Beyonce all the time because you want to be married to her, but you can't because she's already married." And I'm like, that's exactly why. That is the only reason you got it, right? And so when I use, I don't know if I use superlatives, but when I'm interested in talking about the quality of her voice or the curves of her body, like I try and do it with owning that I am doing it in a way that is filled with admiration and also with desire. And that's part of, right, for me, writing queerly, is to not pretend like I'm objective. Right? It doesn't mean I don't have criticisms of Beyonce. You already have heard some of them. But to own that this is also an embodied experience for me. And I think that is one thing that I haven't seen written about as much in regards to Beyonce. There's been, you know, a lot of important stuff about what she means to gay men, but also, what does it mean for a woman to look at Beyonce with a desiring gaze, right? And to invite, am I inviting everybody who reads it to enjoy that? Right? That's also part of the fun of Beyonce. The other thing that I try and do, so I'm trained as a literary critic, and I saw my advisor last spring, and I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm writing a book about Beyonce now. Thank you for teaching me to do literary criticism on French literature. And he's like, well, but this is going to somehow come back to French literature. And I'm like, no, it's not like, the moral is not read French literature, although you should. I started getting frustrated with literary criticism is a lot of it is so ugly, right? Like we're talking about these pretty poems and novels, and we're doing it in terms that we're trying to sound really smart by using language that is just not pretty. And so I tried to, as a mark of respect for the kind of work that writers do, to try and write more in a way that was more like a novel, right? Like a poem. And so as I was writing the Beyonce book, by no means do I write music, but I tried to think about, like, what does it mean to try and write musically, right? To be attentive to sounds and to refrains, and to think about, okay, these are the verses and this is the bridge. And so I try to not distance myself, like this is the work of the artist and it's subjective, and this is the work of the critic and it's objective, but in both of those ways to blur those two, because I think they are blurry.
And it's when I first So the book's not out yet. It comes out in November. Like, pre-order it now. But I read an advance copy, and one of the things that surprised me about it was like, you're doing criticism. Like, you're quoting theorists, and of course talking about your own experience. But also it's highly readable. It's already been excerpted in, I think, like Entertainment Weekly, which is on the opposite side of the spectrum from like literary criticism, and the ways that we write about that kind of stuff.
Maybe.
And did you find yourself having to temper the critical scholarly part, or did you find yourself sort of easily like doing that, trying to write it? Because as you say, like, literary criticism is not known for being beautiful. How did you tear it away from sort of the awful ways that it's often written?
I've been unlearning to write the way that I learned in graduate school for years, and consciously so. And I think I needed to learn to write the way that it's always been done, right? You need to know how to do a thing before you can write back against it. And so, in my first book, I tried to do some of that. My second book that came out earlier this year, it's written in 3 different voices. Like, there's one chapter that goes back and forth between Whitney Houston, God rest her soul, Azalea Banks, and Sharon Bridgeforth, who was here for many years, right? I'm talking about all those things and weaving in and out of them. And that I really consciously did in a way that I imagined it was a conversation of voices. So by the time that I got to, and I think it was just something being more honest. Like, how do the voices in my head work? It's the voice of a theorist meets the voice of an internet troll, right? Like, and those things come together as I go through my day. And somebody who I met at yoga class, and we had a conversation about something. And all of those things, to me, all of those things are meaningful ways of making sense of the world, right? And so I think people are sometimes surprised, because I do this in my so-called academic writing too, that I'll put blog posts alongside what people think of as high theory. And I'm like, it's all just people trying to make sense of the world. So it took me, because we're so trained to think. And I think especially as a woman of color in the academy, I gotta do it really, really good so people will think that I'm smart. But if I'm not coming with my own voice and valorizing that the way that I'm smart matters too, then what's the point, right? So it took a lot of years of trying to be more honest on the page of what makes sense to me and what doesn't. And I think, what these high theorists say is not necessarily more complicated than what my 8-year-old says. And I'm not just saying that because I think she's really smart. I'm saying that because I think we all understand the world in really complicated ways. And that part of me, because there's a lot of people, how could you teach a course about Beyonce? It's so lowbrow, da-da-da-da. And I'm like, well, where is that judgment coming from? If people make sense of the world through a Beyonce lyric, why is that worse than a Shakespeare line? Right? Shakespeare having been really popular theater in his time as well. I'm just, I guess as the young people say, I'm just not here for it.
Kaylee, when you're thinking about next articles to propose, and you've written about, we've mentioned Liz Phair and Meg White, Amy Winehouse. Artistically, those are quite different artists. Mm-hmm. There are some connections in terms of the consumer aspect, like how we sort of like receive their work.
And they're all white women.
Yeah. Do you think about do you have an oeuvre of criticism, or do you just the way that we're talking about, just things strike you and you run with it?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, and it definitely brings up larger conversations about how the music writing industry works. I try and be really careful about what I do write about and what I don't write about. I try to tell stories that I think aren't being told enough. Usually it's that, like, all writing is sort of just me screaming really loud, like, I have something to say, shut up. And so if I ever have that sense about something, like, that's usually a good sign. But generally, yeah, I want to write about things that are maybe a little underrepresented or haven't been looked at from a certain angle. But I also want to be aware of what's not really mine to write about. And I think that there's a huge dearth of, that means lack of, right? Dearth? Of queer writers and writers of color in, like, the music criticism world. And a lot of times, like, even especially a consequence, like, we don't have almost any Black writers, and yet, like, so much of the biggest, most important popular music is made by Black artists, and so much of the less popular but extremely critically important music is made by Black artists, and so much of the underappreciated music. And it's not, like, I try and encourage as much as I can the publications I write for to find the right person to talk about something versus just the default person.
How do you do that?
Oh, with conversations with editors, and Twitter's a good place to try and, like, urge more accountability, and to celebrate people who are doing great work and maybe not getting represented for it. It takes active work. It's a proactive thing. It's not, and it's same for women writers. Like, there's not that many at Consequence. And yeah, there's a huge disparity, I think. So I try and write about things that I have something unique and individual to say about.
Kayleigh, can I just say you're super cool, and if I were going to be here for the next big Frida concert, we would totally, like, have a girls' night and dye our hair and then go.
I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Normally we would have a mic and we'd run around, but we don't have that mic with us. So just shout out your question, raise your hand, shout out your question, and we'll. Yes.
You brought up a really good point about Aretha Franklin's death before. It was about how to write about the death of a musical icon in a fresh way that doesn't feel stale. And I was wondering if maybe we could discuss that a little more.
Yeah, you have any thoughts? I mean, we've sort of been, like, it's been Aretha all day long. I was at a coffee shop earlier, and it was, Respect was played, I think, 10 times in 1 hour. I don't think they know that there's other songs. Like, how, there is a kind of, like, thing that happens now when a major artist dies, and there is a major outpouring, and they get talked about in particular kinds of ways.
I want to bring up one practical thing to remember about this, is that, and this is going to sound very clinical, but it's absolutely true, people who published things today about her had a little bit of a head start because people knew that she had been sick for a little while. The news broke 2 or 3 days ago that she was not doing well, and people started working up pieces that could run today. Don't let stuff that came out today be the only things that you read about. People need, you need time to think about something, and the internet does not allow for that. And so if this is something that you're interested in, and because it's Aretha Franklin and because you're in this room, it's something you should be interested in, give it a week and let people think hard about this and think in interesting ways about it. The same thing happened when Bowie died. The same thing happened to a lesser extent when Michael Jackson died, but that was in internet time. That was forever ago, even though it was 9 years ago. But yeah, that's the one thing I would say about her is give people a little bit of time to think about it. And in the next week or so, the stuff that and the next month and the next year, the stuff you read about then, I think will be richer and more rewarding than the stuff that came out today. And that is in no way to talk smack about people who wrote about her today. People have jobs, this is what they do, and something's got to go up. But don't let what you read about her be just the stuff that came out today.
I totally second that. And yeah, I think that the industry is prepared for how to write about celebrities that just died, which is a really weird thing to have be part of your professional, skill set. And so there are people who they shine and they're capable of, synthesizing all of these ideas about an artist or doing really strong, really fast research and putting something out there that is, that is very good, very quickly. But that's just one type of writing, and that's not everybody. But I mean, I wish I knew how to do that. I don't at all. Every time something significant happens, and I'm like, oh, I wish I was able to put something out right away. But I don't think my voice fits in usually. I don't think that I have enough original stuff to say from 15 minutes of thinking. But some people do. It just depends.
I of course am not in the industry, so I can't comment from that point of view, although I completely third thinking about any kind of major musical news. It's not the day after, it's the week after that the interesting thing comes out. I also, what I would love to see more of, I lived in Minneapolis for 6-7 years, and so of course Prince passed about 2 years ago, and the most interesting things I learned about Prince's death were from people who were still living in Minneapolis. I don't know why I say still. People who are living in Minneapolis. A friend of mine told a story about a black man who was stopped by a white police officer for speeding or something. He's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm just so upset over Prince's death. And the police officer was like, oh, I completely understand. Right? Go ahead. And, right?
It's
so,
citywide day of mourning.
Yeah, and I think those stories of what the artist, and I think this goes back to what y'all were saying earlier of what people's art means to people are some of the most interesting tributes that I've heard.
So I'm gonna finish with one question, and then y'all can come up and chat afterward. One thing we like to end on is what are you working on that we can look forward to? What's coming out into the world soon, or what do you work on, Joe?
That's a really good question. I write for a daily newspaper, so I have something in there a couple times a week. The nature of daily newspaper writing is sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not very good. And that's just how it goes. I write about film a lot for The Statesman. I don't write as much about music. I sort of took a break from writing about music after the book was finished because I just needed a breather and sort of figure out what the next step was in what I wanted to do. But I usually have film reviews in The Statesman pretty regularly. I'm writing about a movie called Support the Girls that I thought was really good. Next week, I have an interview with Andrew Bujalski, who directed that film.
Kaylee, how about you?
I usually have 1 to 3 album reviews in Consequence of Sound. It's just a website. There's no physical element every month. So I just had a Omise'eke review published. Interpol's review is coming up next week. And I'm actually working on my own 33 1/3 pitch, so I want to learn about how to submit the proposal from Joe. And music writing doesn't make you all that much money, so I have a grown-up job too. So that's what I do a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Omise'eke?
And I have Beyonce Information is coming out in November. And then in the spirit of encouraging people to read other important things, I'm interested in working on the novellas of a black trans woman from Baltimore, Dane Figueroa Edidi, who does fabulous speculative fiction. Look up her stuff.
What was the name again?
Dane Figueroa Edidi, E-D-I-D-I. She has a website, beautiful stuff, and I hope to have conversations with people about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Please give our panelists a warm round of applause.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.